Hi, you're listening to Irish Stew, the podcast for the global Irish nation. I'm Martin Nutty, and together with my co-host John Lee, we're working to bring all the Irish together, whether you're hyphenated or not. We'll be talking to Irish people of excellence about their lives, what they do, their successes and failures, and how they relate to that small green rock off the coast of Europe. If you like what we're doing in this space, please remember to subscribe to Irish Stew, and even better, leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. Hi, this is Martin Nutty, and you're listening to Irish Stew, the podcast for the global Irish nation. I'm joined by my co-host, John Lee. Say hello, John.
Hey, Martin. Good to talk to you again. I know you got to wait for a couple of days. Are you fresh, fit, and dangerous now?
Yeah, I was out in Long Island, all the way out, like on the eastern tip for those non-New Yorkers that are listening. So Long Island is quite long. So I was out in a place called Amagansett, just miles and miles of beach, and it was quite empty and totally delightful.
Sounds lovely. Well, summer's over, so back to work, and I know we got a good guest today.
Yeah, so John, I'm delighted to have Bridget Bray on the podcast. Bridget is New York-based and owns her own company called BBNY, which operates in the lifestyle events and experience space. Now, specifically, I asked Bridget to come on the show as she's an expert in matters genealogy. I know Bridget has done extensive research on her own family and also moderates a number of internet-based groups devoted specifically to Irish genealogy. One that jumps to mind, I believe, is a meetup group for, I believe it's Irish and British ancestry. Anyway, because you always need an interesting stat, back in 2014, ABC News listed genealogy as the second most popular hobby in the USA. How about them apples?
That's pretty. That completely takes me by surprise on one level, but it's clear, a nation of immigrants here in the U.S. We're interested in where we came from, be it Ireland, be it Italy, be it Albania, Ethiopia. People do want to know where their roots are. But I'd like to say, before we let Bridget get a word in edgewise, when you say the word genealogy, Martin, I have to admit my eyes water up. But it's not because I'm sentimental. It's because when I hear the word genealogy, it sounds dusty. It sounds like old, musty, dusty libraries and records offices and basements of churches, things like that. But when I knew we had Bridget coming on, I looked at some of her information, and I looked at her meetup groups, and I looked at her Facebook page, and I didn't feel the dust. The allergy went away. I saw something that looked fresh and contemporary, and actually it got me interested.
Okay, so why don't we bring Bridget online here? So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Bridget to the podcast. How you doing, Bridget?
I'm doing great. Yes, glad to be here.
Welcome.
So just by way of background, Bridget, I believe you live in New York. Well, I know you live in New York, but I believe you're originally from the Great White North.
That's correct, yes. Born and bred and raised in Toronto, and have been living in New York for the better part of 12 years. So I guess I'm a kind of a Can-American, perhaps.
Bridget, are you able to speak Canadian?
What do you mean, eh?
There you go. That's what I wanted to
hear. No, I dropped that. Fortunately, years ago, I went over to Australia and I lost that A element, but I know it often comes up.
How about the out and about?
Yes, I'm guilty of that. I thought I had moved away from it, but every time I say out and about, did I meet the needs on the Canadian side of things? I'm sure I did.
Well, whenever Martin gets an Irish person on the podcast, suddenly he's like back in Dublin. I can barely understand what he's saying.
There you go.
So let's just kick this off in very simple terms. I imagine that we have listeners that have some Irish blood coursing through their veins and may have some interest in tracing their ancestry. So if you had a brand new newbie to the whole ancestry thing, Bridget, what would your top pieces of advice be to get people started out?
Well, there are a number, but I'll isolate it just to a few. I mean, first and foremost, I think it's an exciting path to undertake because it's discovering more about you and your family, whatever that might look like. So I think to begin, it's about the incredible world, the incredible discoveries that await, whatever they may look like. But I think up front, people can get potentially easily frustrated, trying to think that they can answer all the questions they have about their family history. And so I always say, start simple, right? Start with yourself and work backwards. Another element that I find that people are not always prepared for, and even as they build experience, it's still an adjustment, and that's about accuracy. Today, if you don't present your right identification, for example, at the airline desk, you're not going to get on the flight because it doesn't match up to the ticket, to your identification. Well, that's not the case when it comes to genealogy, especially as you go back in time. An Irish genealogy, there's a lot of inaccuracy. So that I find is something that often surprises people. And then I would also say that a common piece is that people have a misnomer that the records were either completely destroyed, therefore why start? And then I think the last piece is that often people are so, especially if they're based out of Ireland, they want to jump over into Ireland and begin the research. And there's a few things that need to be considered before then. So those would be, I think, the top ones of many that I would say about beginners.
So I guess there's what you're highlighting is a danger associated with entry point. So people immediately want to identify that immigrant ancestor and hop across the Atlantic and find exactly where they came from, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, I understand the draw, right? I mean, with as you could say, the draw to Ireland, people may already know that they have family links or have been told that they do. It's a natural sort of path to say, well, listen, let me find them in Ireland. But if that is an ancestor or your tie is several generations back, that could lead you down a path of not discovering anything for some time. So that's why you really have to start with yourself first.
Hey, Bridget, I read something that was written kind of a Q&A in Irish Central a few years back. And the question was the internet important? And that was 7 years ago. How has the internet transformed what you're doing? And does that make it even more sense to do your work up front before you take the big trip?
Well, I mean, I think that anyone who is embarking on genealogy today is incredibly fortunate because there is so much at your fingertips, literally online. So it's given people an access that may have not been ever able to do before, right? If you think about before records were digitized, you would actually have to go to the repository office. And I'm not saying that there might not be the dust and the old books and everything attached there, which I think is part of the gem of doing the genealogy research. But then you have restrictions about, well, if you're living here in the US, you might not be able to get across to Ireland, and conversely, vice versa. So online, I think, has really not only brought an ease of research, but it's brought a greater access to more people. And I think that is an incredibly critical piece.
Now, if we were going to kind of just take you back a step again, what do people stand to lose if they fail to go, if they try to jump straight to that immigrant ancestor? What are they not capturing that's really going to help them?
Well, what it can do is, as I said, it's not saying that you might not discover something, but you're going to find that you're either going to find an abundance of records, especially if we're talking about common surnames. And how do you then determine that, say, a Kelly is your Kelly or a Ryan is your Ryan? So it goes back to that sort of methodical path of being able to link back to Ireland. So let's say you're second or third generation here in the US. Well, start to build the birth, death, and marriage records of individuals of the generations above and above that, because that allows you to trace back to wherever their locations are. But you could find yourself, I mean, how do you find a needle in a haystack? So you say you've got Irish ancestry and you think it's going to be somewhere in Ireland, but that's going to be such a large, encompassing task to undertake that I think frustration would and does quickly happen for those that undertake that route.
Hey, Bridget, when you first started talking about genealogy here, you started talking about a desire to go back and find out where your family is from, your family. Well, I'm going to guess that you're your journey here in genealogy probably did begin with your family. So perhaps you could take us a little bit through that, and what did you find when you glanced into your family roots?
Yeah, well, it absolutely did. I mean, it was the trigger. Literally a month before I moved to the US, I uncovered that a part of my ancestry was Irish. I had not known that. I had always thought it was English. And so, with that in mind, if I try to go back, now we're talking 13 odd years, I think I Googled, I think I came across, a website that listed this, and I just had no clue what to do. But the only item that I had was a death certificate of an ancestor of mine, my great-grandfather. So I went because I'm impatient and I wanted information yesterday. No clue about doing a methodical path or anything like that. And I went across to a family history or a genealogy show in London. And I was walking around the space aimlessly. I mean, there was plastic tablecloths, there was paper, in piles. I just didn't know what to make of this. And DNA was just sort of emerging at that point. And I thought, you know what? As I walked around, I thought, this is not doing anything for me. I had a woman say, the surname is Ryan. Good luck. You won't find anything. I'd love to find her now, by the way. But my very last stop, just before I left, happened to be this booth that was about probate. And I gave them this death certificate, again, having no clue about anything. They entered it in, and they said, well, yes, we actually have a will for your great-grandfather. And it was this, wow. So for me, I've always been a big fan of wills. I was fortunate that that was something that gave a lot of information. And from there, I came back, I started going online. And again, there were records there, but not as extensive they are as today, and started to build out the family tree. But I did not have the benefit of having any records or much information. Most of the research and information I uncovered, I had to revert to records. There was a little bit that I gathered from my mother, but there wasn't a lot known. And so then that began the whole path. And as a result of that, yes, I formed groups, I've put on events, I've done workshops, and I've connected and found out a lot more about Irish history that I never would have done if I hadn't uncovered that a part of my history, family history, was Irish.
So I know in this space, one of the difficulties, especially in America, that descendants from an Irish immigrant faces is trying to kind of locate the place in Ireland where the immigrant ancestor came from. Can you throw any light on those challenges and how best to address it?
I thought for a second you were going to say light on, finding the absolute solution. I thought, well, it really depends. So there's a few channels. And again, these are not going to be guaranteed or they're not going to work for everyone. But there's certainly some strategies that I've used and I know other researchers use. So one of them, as I mentioned a moment ago, is about surnames, right? We all know that there's several surnames that are very rampant across Ireland and can be very difficult to try to isolate further. So one route can be that you can look at least from a historical standpoint, in the mid-19th century, people weren't traveling as extensively as they are now today. And so there were pockets where surnames gravitated to one or more counties than others. So that might be, if you will, a potential starting point. It doesn't narrow it down extensively, but it gives you a sense of direction. And I'll use my example. I had no clue where the Ryans were from when I first started. But when I looked at, and it's a website called johnbrenham.com, and I looked at the surnames, I found that the Ryans typically around the Tipperary and Limerick area. And lo and behold, my family history is tied to Limerick. So that's one path. Obviously, if you can find the townland, and that might be in some of the records that you're able to cite. For example, it could be within a birth or marriage or death record. If you're fortunate to be able to find that, that might help isolate the geography. But I will say this, if you're able to find the townland, that is going to help narrow down and lead you down to certain resources that are going to be helpful to you. I'll give another example. A few years ago, the National Library of Ireland released online parish records. Phenomenal. However, the way that they're structured is if you don't know your townland, you could be going and spending hours trying to find your ancestors. So that's why it's so important. It's not always easy to do, but if you can isolate to the townland, that really helps move the path forward.
Can I just ask, I mentioned before to Bridget that I was in charge of asking the dumb questions on this program because Martin knows a bit about genealogy and I don't. What is a townland? What does that refer to?
Great question. So there's a lot of different geographical boundaries. The townland is the most critical, and it's basically a division within a civil parish, if you will. So there's a lot of, you've got the overall island, you've got provinces, you've got baronies, and then you've got townland. So just imagine it being a community, a small geographical element within a community. And it's, if you will, in some ways, an identifier for where someone is from. Now, I'll put a little asterisk just to add a little jazz to the mix, is that there can be townland names repeated across Ireland, and there also can be townlands that have multiple names. So that adds another dynamic. But that's what it is. It's basically a small area of land within the civil jurisdiction.
Now, you mentioned up front, Bridget, that a lot of people believe that it's actually impossible to trace Irish ancestry because all the records are gone. Can you clarify that a little bit more? Why people would think that?
Well, I mean, obviously, if we want to call it the headline, headline of all headlines as it relates to genealogy and records, it's the fire in the Four Courts that took place in 1922. And with that, granted, a significant number of records did get destroyed. There are a few remnants that are there, but you're predominantly looking at a selection of records. So outside of that, though, there are opportunities to look at alternate sources. So the biggest impact that you hear about the Four Courts fires are the census records that were taken across the 19th century. So every 10 years, a census was taken in Ireland. The first half ended up being destroyed, and the second half ended up being destroyed through another channel. So collectively, you lose those records. And so when people heard about it, it was sort of, well, why bother? Because there's nothing else to really tap into. I'm not going to get anywhere. But as time has passed, and again, going back to that digitization of records and making more information available online, there are other records that are surfacing. And I always look at it that if you're able to find and be able to track your family history to a certain point, you have to adopt a lot of creativity in your strategy for research. So yes, we all want the birth, marriage, death, and hopefully that is a path you can undertake, followed by census records. But if you start to look at other records, such as newspapers, or perhaps it's looking at gravestones, or it's looking at petty court sessions, you can find other information that can help build your family tree.
Yeah. So a lot of these records, as you mentioned now, are coming online. In other words, there's a process of digitization. I'm not sure if that's actually a word.
It might be one I've come up with.
But there are two issues, it seems to me, that might revolve around them. First of all is the actual transcription issue from the original record into the digital record. Now, if you have an unusual last name like me, Nutty, N-U-T-T-Y, my name has been misspelled fairly frequently, I've found, in Irish records. I don't know if you've come across stuff along those lines frequently.
Oh, yes. I mean, that goes back to that, I'll put it under the banner of accuracy, from what people expect, looking at a census record from one period, let's say 1901 to 1911, which is the two most current, if you will, Irish census, and saying, well, this can't be my ancestor because they're 65 in 1901 and they're 83 in 1911. So there's that element of accuracy, certainly, that comes into play. But the transcription piece, so here's where there's so many sites out there where you can get access to records for paid or for free purposes. Now, not at all times can you get access to the original by the original, if you will, holder. So you have these sites that sell subscriptions or get access to records, but they've transcribed it. And in fact, just recently, I was looking at a website that holds records. They're not the original owners, if you will. And whomever they had used to transcribe, the letters did not correspond whatsoever to the content in there. And I have a feeling that someone had put their fingers on the keys and had shifted over a couple of letters and typed it. That's how poor it was. So that's why, as a beginner, as an intermediate, as an advanced researcher, where at all possible, one should really try to source the original to make a comparison. And you may even find that the original had errors in it. But when I go back to the release of the parish records, those were the original records. Well, there were sites that had transcribed that, and people found discrepancies that were not attributed to discrepancies at the time the information was taken. It was the discrepancy that resulted from someone transcribing the information inaccurately.
So I guess you're telling us, especially for delicate flowers like John, that he will actually have to go into the musty basement at least at some point in time, just to make sure that the digital search is verified by the actual hard copy, so to speak.
Well, not entirely. Obviously that is a nice to have to be able to do that, but there are websites that hold the original record. And I'll give you an example. irishgenealogy.ie, stemmed from the Irish government. And they've made accessible records directly from their portal, all online. And when you look up a name and you're able to see, then below there's a link to the image. That image is an actual image of that record. Now, obviously, you want to cross-reference that what they put in the text matches it, but that's an opportunity where you don't have to go into a dusty cobweb location. In other instances, you can't help but do that because the full record or the record is not available online. But I would say today in 2020, in most instances, you should be able to get a good majority of records online that are the original. I'll give one other example. The 1901 and 1911 census, those are online, and those are the original records. But when you start to look at companies like Ancestry, MyHeritage, Family, Find My Past, those are all repositories of a tremendous amount of records that are incredibly valuable. But while they have purchased the records, they're not the original issuer. They were not the agency, if you will, that went out and did the census or secured the birth, marriage, and death. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of the approach.
And in terms of internet services, that do you have a preferred one that you like to use? What would your recommendation, especially for somebody that's particularly interested in the Irish part of their ancestry?
So I would say this would be the path that I would suggest, with the caveat that everyone's history is different. So if it skews a little bit more, say, English than Irish at some points, or it has a stronger or heavier base in other pockets of the world, it might be a slightly different path. The first thing I would say out of the gate is that all of those companies I've mentioned, Find My Past, Ancestry, MyHeritage, they all offer an opportunity to sign up and have a trial for 2 weeks. So out of the gate, you could potentially have 6 weeks of access to these sites, getting to understand what types of records they have. In fact, if you like the experience too, because they all offer different experiences. So that's the first thing that I would say. Then I would say that you can also look and access free websites. So the Irish Genealogy, if you know you can land in Ireland. Family Search is another free one as well. Doesn't necessarily have all the original records. But after a certain point in time, you need to start channeling, or you need to start determining what path you're going to take. So I would say start with Ancestry. But then as you start to find that you are moving closer or more into Ireland, the island of Ireland, that's where I would say a resource like Find My Past has some very specialized records that the others may not. And I will preface that each of these websites obviously have a set of records that are unique to them. A lot of them share common ones, but that allows them to offer their ultimate value. But I would say with Find My Past, you can have access to newspaper records that go back to the 1700s, and newspapers are an incredible resource, whether it's specifically for the person or even just a historical context. They've got petty court sessions. You'd be amazed at some of the petty types of crimes that are there. There are dog licenses, and you might be scratching your head saying, dog licenses? Well, if we're trying to establish points in time where people are, that's a great resource that can be tapped into. After that point, there's also another website called Roots Ireland, but that's a paid subscription. So you might be able to get quite far along by using the path I've said, Ancestry, then Find My Past, either using the trial or taking a subscription. But then you might want to look at Roots Ireland. But then the irishgenealogy.ie is where you can get access to birth, marriage, and death records online, free, with original records showing.
So, do you find people that really get into this end up subscribing to multiple services and building up their genealogy habit can get kind of expensive potentially?
It can do so. I would say that people generally sort of follow a path. I don't necessarily feel, unless they were doing extensive research or maybe they're doing research for others, that you would necessarily find people are taking multiple subscriptions out at a time. I think people mostly would do that if there was something about the unique set of records that one had over the other. But you also have opportunities if in your local libraries. Obviously, right now it might be a little bit of a different scenario, but a lot of the libraries will actually have library editions of Ancestry, of Find My Past. So that's another channel that people can play and go across multiple of them. But I would say, back to your question, is most are usually using one resource while tapping into others. And then if they find that that resource either becomes too expensive or they've moved past it, then they might stop the subscription. Maybe they'll look for another one, or they'll continue down a different path.
Bridget, great information for anybody either starting the genealogy journey or well along the way. I'm sure there's some tips and tricks there that people hadn't considered before. I'd like to kind of bring it into a specific here and just bring up a genealogy story that really caught my attention. Was the few years back, the person who traced Barack Obama's roots back to Ireland. Do you know anything about that story?
I do remember the story, and in fact, I actually met Henry VIII as he was known locally or colloquially out of Tipperary. So yes, I'm familiar. He was the, I think, 16th. He was somehow linked to in a distance of a great-great-great-grandparent, if I remember. But yes, right. I'm familiar with the story.
Yeah, Henry VIII. Actually, I wonder if you met him at the Irish Business Organization. He spoke, and he also was in our parade. He was in our contingent for the St. Patrick's Day parade. And strangely enough, you put them side by side. They're physically very similar. Henry and Barack Obama, tall, slim guys. And I take a particular interest because Barack traces his Irish ancestry back to the family name of Carney. And that's one of my grandparents was Carney. So I'm also related to Barack Obama until anybody proves it otherwise.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I met him actually if I recall, it was the pub that his aunt ran in Donegal. And it was the pub that was across from, I'll call it the main pub, or the pub that Obama stopped in. So I met him there and had a brief conversation. But yeah, and I mean, there's an example. Carney is a very common name. So, unless you're able to do the path back from yourself to the generations back, then you start to say, okay, well, where was the Carney name most prevalent, at least in the mid-19th century? Because that might give some indication as to where there might be a hub still today.
Right. And I'm not going to research that one because I don't want to know if the answer is we're not related, I don't want to know it.
That's right. Well, you know what? I always say, believe the story until you have reason not to, so if people believe it and you don't have to prove it, go for it, right? Just maybe not put it on a family tree too readily.
Well, if I do get going and I do want to research this and I take some Claritin with me and I can go down into those dusty archives, how are the diaspora viewed in Ireland when they come back and they start doing these kinds of things, when they start poking around for their great, 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 great ancestors? How are they viewed?
Well, I'll even use my own example. I would say that initially it might have been, some years back, it would be like, oh, here they come, looking for their ancestors. And I think it was, at least from my experience, it was kind of like with a little bit of a comic look, like, oh, here they come traipsing around looking for their ancestors. But I would say that landscape has changed, and from a few accounts. One is going back to that notion that why begin research? There's no records, which was a sentiment that many in Ireland thought too. And so it was a sense, why even get started? But they have started. And from what I have sensed, it was the release of those parish records with the National Library of Ireland and people digging in and finding information, sometimes not always expected, an extra sibling in the past or another relative they were not aware of, that sort of prompted that interest. So I then saw and believe that shift became to an appreciation and to a welcome, not saying that there was not a welcome before, but I think it was, as I said, a little kind of, here they come. And I use my own example, at the beginning, it was, oh, yeah, she's coming over. This one's looking for her ancestor. And now, because I'm in a small village where I have spent my time when I go back, it's sort of, there's a bunch of locals that know what I'm researching. And so when they see me, they actually gravitate to wanting to share information, and they will go to great lengths to get a photograph to you, to get information, if you're able to connect in there. So that's where I say, if you can get across to Ireland and you have a sense or where your links are, it can be a phenomenal experience, because there is nothing like the local knowledge that sits in the memories of those that are based in those respective villages. And sometimes that's information that you would never glean from any digital or paper record.
Yeah, I can see this sort of bemused look on their face initially, but really, what you're talking about are stories. You're a detective uncovering great stories that are related to you, but there's a communality in these stories that this kind of work unveils.
Exactly, and you get used to where initially, I mean, maybe it's my North American sort of perspective. You would make an appointment, or you book, or you plan something if you're going to go over to someone's house. Well, I learned, again, just from the context of the village where I spent time, is people show up all the time, they knock on the door, and no problem. So you have to get used to the knock on the door opening and saying, now I know you don't know who I am, but, and I've done that many times, so I feel like I'm getting experienced in it. And each time I have been very fortunate that not only have I been invited in, but they spend time imparting what they know. And that, to me, goes back to, if someone's just looking to get started, that's magic. It really is.
You're selling me on this, Bridget. You're getting me interested.
Oh, you'll be Googling up tonight saying, where should I start? Yeah, well, there's a quote somewhere, and I'm paraphrasing it, but it's something along the lines of, it starts as an intrigue and an interest, it moves to an obsession, and its final stages, it's an illness. So that could await you with genealogy. Who knows?
So we talked a little bit about digital records. We talked about the dusty records in the basements of governmental buildings and churches. But I think there's more out there. And one thing comes to mind from my own personal experience is letters. It's quite surprising how long letters can last. And so what I've told members of my family is, go look in your attic. Open up that suitcase or trunk that contains something that you have never looked at, because you may find pictures and you may find letters, and they are kind of rich sources. I don't know if you've had any similar experiences along those lines.
I mean, I have a few letters on my own account, nothing that I would say were pivotal from a research standpoint, but absolutely. And you can extend it, right? You can say, well, any sort of correspondence or communication that's stored in an attic, tucked into something, whether it's photos, whether it's letters. Bibles are often a great source of information, particularly here in North America. You can also have, and I've done some research, I'm very passionate about culinary history, and I've spent some time looking at a whole host of Irish culinary manuscripts, also known as handwritten cookbooks. And I have found in some of them that they're actually indicating that a recipe, this is my cousin, this is my aunt, So you never know where there could be a little clue that's hidden in a box, in an attic, underneath something, on someone's shelf. But absolutely, those are all little nuggets towards uncovering more.
I noticed on your meetup group that some of the titles of the events include the mystifying word brick wall. Can you throw some light on exactly what that means? Because I think that's kind of going along the lines where you're picking up clues. Is that correct?
So brick walls is a term that is often used in genealogy, and it really refers to you may have started, usually you've started some level of research and you just can't get past a certain point. You just can't find a particular ancestor, or you found a certain level, but there's a mystery or a gap. And so people talk about brick walls as a research barrier. And so what you're referring to are the monthly sessions that I've held virtually and online, whereby a couple of brick walls are presented where they can't find someone or they can't find a record, and a collective group come together. And after the brick wall is presented, this group, and it's incredible. Sometimes there's as many as 15, 20 different paths, up to and including some who are madly logging into whatever service or whatever sites they're familiar with and saying, hey, listen, sometimes they've actually found the person while we're on doing the brick walls. But yes, that's often a path that I would say everyone should expect to encounter at some point in time.
So great. Now I know my first insider buzzword for genealogy.
Oh, you got it.
Brick
yeah.
wall.
Oh, I encountered a brick wall. You'll be definitely on the path.
Excellent.
So does that response go to the question as to whether genealogy should be a solitary or a communal effort?
Well, I would say that it is a pretty much an individual, I guess, if you will, hobby or series of steps that are undertaken, because more often than not, and obviously it's not the same across every family, but the majority, there's the one person who's interested, right? Then it's a varying level of interest that the balance of the family has, right? So I always use this adage, you start talking about, oh my goodness, I've just discovered my great-grandfather of 17 such and such who did this, and his eyes are blue, and he's 6'3". You're so excited because this is cracked open, maybe a brick wall, or it's moved you past a generation. And you sometimes might encounter the glazed look on the person across from you or the people across from you. And there's just not that level of interest. So I do believe there's that very individual element within the family itself. But outside of that, the power of collaboration, I really think, is something that should continue to be perpetuated. You find some of it, for example, if you go to some of these shows or these conferences where people are connecting and chatting maybe to the person who's seated beside them. But with something like the meetup group, I have found it's been very powerful for people to share their experiences, their tips. We actually had one time where, lo and behold, two members of the meetup group actually discovered that they'd lived in the same house in Long Island at different points of time. I've had people uncover that they may find that they're linked. So I do think the power of collaboration moves it from that individual isolated family is probably not interested to a group of people who get that when you find something, that is like striking gold.
So we probably should ask this question up front. When people glaze over, do you try to convince them that this is a meaningful, helpful, an activity that has value? How do you justify all this effort that people engage in? Why is it important?
I think it takes different sort of strains. There's the element of connecting with who you are, maybe culturally, maybe historically. Maybe it's uncovering an element around your family history that was not known. So there's a mystery or a discovery. But I think at the long haul, there's just going to be an element of people that are not interested. I would say there's a spectrum, right? There's others that are, it starts with the one who wants to do all the research and gets really jazzed about making the discoveries, right? So we'll say that that's at the top of the spectrum. The next person down might be interested in the research results, but is not interested in doing the research themselves. It's too detailed, it's too focused, it's not down their path. And then there may be the person who's just sort of taking in the information, is saying, yeah, that's somewhat of interest. And then there's the person who has absolutely no interest. It's just an area that has no draw to them whatsoever. And I think you can try to convince someone that they're interested in it, but if they're not, then they're not going to be. The one little element where I see that potentially having an impact or changing that is with DNA, because DNA is a different sort of curiosity path. You can do your DNA and you don't have to look up, conceivably, your birth, marriage, and death record. It tells you this magic percentage of what you are, even though that really is something that is the least accurate part about these DNA tests. That might be where you get someone who's not into genealogy, intrigued about their history or their medical history through science.
Bridget, Martin and I kind of jump back and forth occasionally. And while you guys were talking, I thought back to that question I asked earlier about how these genealogy hunters from America, from Canada, from the diaspora are perceived. And I'll kind of recount a story of my sort of, I guess it wasn't genealogy at this point, but when I was in Ireland many, many years ago, I hitchhiked out of Dublin and arrived in Clara in County Offaly, where my grandmother, Rose Keenahan, was from. And I didn't have much more than that, except that the family ran a store and they owned some taxis. That's about all I knew. And I ended up in the store, and they sort of gradually started figuring out who I was. It was like, oh, he's Rose's people. They remember Rose had made one trip back on an ocean liner, like in the 50s, and some people remembered her arrival. And then they kind of adopted me, and they drove me around, and they showed me where Rose's house was. And then when we came back and we met the rest of the family, they said, we showed him where Rose lived. We showed him the old house. And there was this immediate kind of glance around the room like, why did you do that? Why did you show him the ancestral homeland? I felt like there was a fear that I was going to make some sort of claim on the property. Is that a concern? Do people kind of, are you digging a little too deep here?
I haven't encountered it, but I go back to that element of you just have to expect anything, just as you would with genealogy and DNA. You may encounter, I've been very fortunate that in my own path, I have encountered only but access and people willing to give me information. However, not in my own direct family history. It was amassed, right? So there was not that information readily available. But through the locals, I have found them very open, very engaged, and definitely wanting to see if they can help. There's this kind of, what I've seen and witnessed is there's this exchange and this excitement about tapping into the other person who's the person who knows this, who knows this. And as it relates to the whole, legacy or ancestral bit, there is sensitivity about land, certainly, but I have not encountered what you're describing. Not to say that it may not happen. I've only found that people have been very receptive, and that is increased.
Well, it was a lovely visit. They were terrific to me. I had a great time, but I just remember that one little sensation that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see.
Yeah, you never know, right? Because actually, I do remember. Actually, come to think of it, I had done one of my knock on the door. I know you don't know me, and I got some information, and it was on Sunday, church day, and I thought I probably shouldn't go, but people said, oh, no, go, no problem. And there was a little hesitation, and I did find out later that maybe there was some connection between two people that I was researching that maybe hadn't been overly favorable. So there was a little bit of that, but I kind of take that in stride because the locals, as I said, what you've described, the ability to be in that village or that town, and people will direct you. I've gone to one place and say, well, you should go to the nursing home. I visited the nursing home, spoke to the person there. Then they said, you need to go to this person. I drove up to that driveway. I'm relentless. If you give me the lead, I'll go down that path. And I'll just add one thing that I found really helpful that connected me to local communities is I reached out to the editors of some of these local newspapers and, of course, touting that I was, contacting from New York and America, was wondering if they could post a letter to their readers about what I was trying to uncover. And in both instances where that happened, and I placed my email, I got direct contact back from people who had recalled that individual or individuals, and they were able to give me information. So again, I can't say enough about if you can be in a local village or town and you have some information armed with you, I think it leads to endless stories and opportunities.
Now, earlier on, you talked very briefly about DNA and people kind of, hey, I'm 50% Irish or 30% English or whatever. And that not being terribly helpful in terms of building out your tree. Have you found aspects of that to be useful in terms of identifying lost ancestors, if you will?
So DNA testing is incredible for being able to open up opportunities, potentially close gaps, but there's always the understanding that it shouldn't be instead of, we'll call it the paper trail or doing the traditional genealogy research, because it's not going to tell you when you have your DNA test, oh, this is your great uncle Tom and this is your great aunt Betty. It's not going to do that. It is going to give you this percentage, as you described, the 50% Irish or the 20% English, but that's the least accurate. And people get really drawn to that. I mean, that's in some ways how those tests have been marketed. What percentage are you? But it can change. I've known people who have gone back to see their results. They've gone into the DNA portal, say about a year later, and it's completely flipped in their percentages. It's even happened on my account. And that's attributed to the algorithms. They're constantly updating them based on new research and new results. So the information that's accurate within the DNA test, bar the very minimal percentage that's not, is the relationships that it's showing that your DNA is matching with someone. So bar, as I said, a very rare exception, those matches are what are accurate. And that's what you want to try to uncover, how you're connected to those individuals. And when we talk about Irish history in particular, there was obviously, way back in the day, we talk about mother and child homes, we talk about residential schools, we talk about children, orphans, adoptions. And for some instances and for some people, information was denied of them for a whole host of different reasons. And much of that has to do with either sealing the records, choosing to mask them, not make them available. But DNA has opened that up. So that's where I go back. That's the accurate piece. The matches and the connections, the cultural piece, less so.
Bridget, this has really been great. You got me interested. So that you've made a convert here. Really interesting stuff. I was having a thought as we're kind of getting towards the end here. Ireland has been a country of emigration. That's why we're here in North America talking to each other. But increasingly, Ireland is seeing immigration. And I wonder if somewhere down the road, the descendants of the Polish immigrant, the Nigerian, the Syrian, who are making their homes in Ireland now, I wonder if we're going to see a kind of a genealogy search from them back to their ancestral homelands.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, as I said, where someone may not be interested from a genealogy perspective, the DNA piece is opening up. I think even in addition to the cultural element and the dynamic changing that way, you also have the dynamic of the family is redefined now in a way that didn't exist before. So whether it's adoption or surrogate or the different definition, as I said, of a family, I think that's going to really make it interesting as one does research, say in 100 or 150 years. So you look at it from a standpoint, you can have same-sex couples, then you can look at it from a transgender, you can look at it from a whole host of different elements, surrogates, adoptions, and then how are you going to be able to do your research then? It might make for some serious brick walls potentially.
Okay. I think this has been really interesting, but we're moving along to a segment of the podcast which we like to call the shameless plug. And what we'd like you to provide to listeners that are interested in exploring this subject area a bit more, information about what you do, where they can find you and your groups, etc.
Happy to do so. And anytime that I can draw more people in some way, shape, or form to genealogy, it's exciting. Like even just in this conversation, I'm probably going to find myself Googling after something on the genealogy front. So there's a few ways. Obviously, right now everything is virtual because I run a New York-based Irish-British genealogy group. And when there's an opportunity to bring people live again, there has been a number of events where I've organized with different repositories, whether it's libraries, whether it's archives, whether it's having speakers, different types of events. I invite people to join. Now I'm just doing the virtual, which is every month. It's this brick wall session where we try to break down research barriers. And then over and above that, I do a newsletter, and that's through the genealogyevent.com. So that's the website where I house information relative to genealogy. And in particular, I have a beginner's course in Irish genealogy, and it's called Sleuthability. Completely made up word, as I always indicate, but it's about the ability to be a sleuth in genealogy research. So if you're game for a few hours, it's online. I have broken it down into various segments around geography, around history, around research strategies with a lot of material and resource references. That's another way to connect into the world that I do on genealogy.
Great.
It really is an incredible journey. And if I think about how and what the discovery of my ancestry has done, I would have probably not been as extensively connected in the Irish community. I would have not founded the events that I've done, both in genealogy and in food. And I would have missed out an opportunity to connect with people who feel enriched learning more about their history. So I'm a big fan of it.
And more importantly, Bridget, you would have missed the opportunity to be on Irish Stew.
Oh, of course. That goes without saying. And I'm expecting that the listeners now, they're either going to restart their efforts or they're going to start their efforts as it relates to genealogy, or at least ask a few questions within their family at the next gathering, the next conversation. So at such a point, when they are ready, they've got a little information to get started.
And that's all you need.
Exactly.
That's great, Bridget. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Look forward to talking more and comparing notes on our explorations through times past.
Thank you, Bridget.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the conversation.
Hey, well, I really enjoyed speaking with Bridget Bray today. You know what she did? She dusted off the topic of genealogy for me. You know, it got me out of the dusty archives and cleared up my allergy for genealogy and really made it look like an interesting thing to pursue.
You know, I'm kind of a nuts and bolts guy, and that's probably not surprising given my last name. But what I really liked about Bridget was laying out the best approach. And she said, start off with the immediate. In other words, your family, especially older members of your family, because they're going to know more about grandparents and maybe even great-grandparents. And they might have additional information that's not necessarily available on the document trail.
Yeah, those are some of the details beyond me. Although now I do know a buzzword. I know about brick wall. I know what that means. So I think I'm on my way. And what grabbed me was the fact that the genealogy, it's a mystery. You know, it's that unravel the mystery, and it's a puzzle. It's a puzzle you can work out, and you got to find different ways to get to the solution. There's probably a bunch of different ways to attack each problem. So those are some of the things that attracted me. It kind of reminded me to a certain extent of bird watching. You know, there's that elusive crested nuthatch that you never were able to see before, and somehow you find that missing bird or that missing great grandfather. So that's what grabbed me.
Are you messing around with me? You know, like you had to bring up the nuthatch.
Yeah, it's funny.
You know, I'm very sensitive about my name. You know,
as you should be.
But anyway, just using your mystery approach to genealogy is. You only solve a mystery by not listening to naysayers. So there's lots of people out there that will tell you can't find anything about your Irish family. Not true. Bridget laid that out quite clearly. And she actually had, a story herself where she basically went around a big old conference and ultimately found somebody that was able to track an ancestor down through a will. And that will basically revealed a whole lot of additional information and ultimately was the key into her family tree. So don't let the naysayers get you down.
And I'll say one other thing that interested me. You know, it's history, genealogy's history, so it's like backwards looking into the past. But you know, Bridget really had some thoughts putting genealogy out there into the future. What's genealogy going to look like in 15 years? Perhaps when there's even more information, even more readily available on the internet, but also as families have changed so much, the blended families, all the different ways that families look now and will look in the future. What does that mean to genealogy in the future? I thought that was a great way to wrap things up.
Yeah, and another thing, that she brought out was the benefit of essentially leveraging technology so that genealogy is no longer a solitary pursuit. So I'd strongly recommend, and I know Bridget would strongly recommend, joining a group. Obviously, she runs her own group, which is the British and Irish Genealogy Group in New York, and you can find that in Meetup if you do a search. But putting many heads on a brick wall type problem can yield great results. And sometimes all you need is get that one brick in place, and all of a sudden, a whole bunch of other stuff opens up to you. So don't be solitary. Don't be a recluse. You don't have to be a hermit to be a genealogist.
Thanks for joining us for another Global Irish Nation conversation. To see what we're stirring up next, follow us on Twitter at Irish Stewcast or like us on Facebook at Irish Stew Podcast. And you're very welcome to join Martin Nutty and me, John Lee, anytime for another serving of Irish Stew.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.